The Freedom Rides, this attempt to test a federal court order or a court decision which had specified that on interstate commerce there was no segregation. So the announcement by civil rights activists initially associated with the Congress of Racial Equality to test this by taking a group of buses into the Deep South. People are often confused about this because CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, had actually run one of these freedom rides in 1947, right after the court decision, which specified that state segregation laws didn't apply to interstate commerce, because that was federal. That's in the Constitution, it's federal. So that if the bus or train was going across a state line, Jim Crow didn't apply, segregation didn't apply. Well, it did. People, as buses crossed the Mason-Dixon line, knew to reshuffle on the bus, and the blacks go to the back, and the whites go to the front. When that was tested in 47, people were arrested. It was tested again in 1961 with these results in Anniston, Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama, in Montgomery, Alabama. Freedom Riders were set on by mobs, brutally beaten, and had their buses fired on. This, by the way, was the Kennedy administration's response to this was quite interesting. He was about to go to Vienna to meet with Khrushchev for the first time. And suddenly, this is what's on every national newspaper around the world, every international newspaper, every television station around the world. Kennedy's response was to beg for a cooling off period, to urge civil rights workers to stop doing this because they were provoking these confrontations. And he eventually negotiated a deal with the state government of Mississippi that if they would agree not to beat the Freedom Riders, the federal government wouldn't object if they arrested them. So the people arrived, the Freedom Riders arrived in waves at the Greyhound bus station, the Trailways bus station in Jackson. The hotel we were in Jackson, you saw the Greyhound station just across the street. And they were politely arrested and sent up to Parchment Farm. Sometimes not so politely arrested. This is James Meredith integrating the University of Mississippi in 1962. We just this fall celebrated the 50th anniversary of that event. And these are, of course, those iconic pictures of Birmingham, of Bull Connors police dogs, fire hoses. And this, if you prefer happy endings, Lyndon Johnson signing the 1964 Civil Rights Act. You could also find him a year later signing the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Two acts which effectively reestablished the principles that had been enshrined in two constitutional amendments adopted a century before. When we talked about the Reconstruction period, there are three additions to the U.S. Constitution and Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and that one stuck. A 14th Amendment establishing, contrary to the Dred Scott decision, that black people were citizens too, that anyone born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. This has become an issue again in this country around issues of immigration. If you're born here, doesn't matter how you got here, 14th Amendment says you are a citizen of the United States. And if you are a citizen of the United States, you are entitled, according to the amendment, to equal protection of the laws. Well, that particular constitutional amendment, we talked about this a lot last year, becomes effectively a dead letter. And one of the ways around it in the courts is with this doctrine of separate but equal. As long as facilities are substantially equal, they can be separate without violating the guarantee of equal protection laws. The Voting Rights Act, which Johnson signed a year later in 1965, restored the plain sense of the 15th Amendment, the third of the great Reconstruction Amendments. 1865 is the 13th, 1867 is the 14th, 1870 is the 15th, which extended to black men, just keep in mind, only men could vote this time. The right to vote. It says the right to vote cannot be infringed based on race, color, or prior condition of servitude. And as we know, that constitutional amendment was also mocked by a series of legislative and court decisions, which basically specified, and here this was what Mississippi contributed to jurisprudence, the so-called Mississippi Plan of the early 1890s, that you could in fact disfranchise black people as long as you didn't do so on the grounds of their race, their color, or their prior condition of servitude. So you could make people pay a poll tax. You could make them pass a literacy test. You could make them, in the case of Mississippi, pass a literacy test which included interpreting one of the 256, I think, sections of the Mississippi State Constitution. You could allow the local registrar of voters to determine arbitrarily whether that person had passed that literacy test or not. You could install grandfather clauses which exempted people from the poll tax if their grandfather had been eligible to vote, that is white. All of those things were legitimated by the U.S. Supreme Court. So that by the time the civil rights movement begins to gain traction in Mississippi in the early 1960s, about 6% of the black population of the state was allowed to vote. Counties that had black majorities, in some cases, had 0 registered black voters. So this is the canonical story that we tell, right? And if you prefer tragic to happy endings, I could have ended not with Johnson signing one of those 2 momentous pieces of legislation, but one could end, and we'll visit this place in Memphis, with the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968. But the person that I emphasized when we met last time was this person, who I suspect none of you had ever heard of. This is a woman named Ella Baker. And if you ask people who were in the Mississippi movement who the single most important individual in the movement was, who the architect of it was, they will universally tell you Ella Baker. She would resist that label, but in some sense, I think she'd be pleased by her relative obscurity. Because her whole argument was that movements weren't built by famous, celebrated leaders. She said famously Martin Luther King. She said, she's the person who said Martin didn't make the movement made Martin. She also said when you have a movement with big, fancy leaders, usually the press made them, and the press can unmake them. She also said strong people don't need strong leaders. Ella Baker was born in North Carolina. She went to school in New York City. She stayed in New York City and began working as a political activist in the 1930s. In the 40s, she began working for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the venerable civil rights organization founded in the early 20th century by W.E.B. Du Bois, among others. But Ella was always out of step with the NAACP. In part, what she wanted to do was build a grassroots movement. In places like Pike County, even Neshoba County, if you can imagine, Holmes County, there were local chapters of the NAACP. People who actually joined this organization when being called an NAACP card could get you killed. So Ella Baker, that was the NAACP. But to most of the people in headquarters in New York, the NAACP was them. It was their big office in New York. It was filing suits like Brown v. Board, the U.S. Supreme Court. And so, again, it was a movement that she felt was failing fundamentally because of its failure to build from the grassroots. She then went to work in the late 50s with the new organization that had been established after the Montgomery bus boycott, King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. She was also very, very uneasy and unhappy with the style of politics she saw then, which again, she saw, you don't make people strong by teaching them to follow a charismatic leader. You make them strong by helping them discover the resources for leadership, the ingenuity, the wisdom that lay in that community. You don't roll in and try to mobilize them for a big thing and then get on your bus and leave. Because then what have you left? That vision would become the vision of an organization that Ella helped create, SNCC. And that's how everyone called it, SNCC, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. The origins of SNCC go back to 1960, and they go back to the sit-ins in Greensboro. When the sit-ins in Greensboro happened, and black students elsewhere saw the step that people just like them had taken, in a sense, those students in Greensboro threw down a challenge to all black students. And throughout the South, soon in more than 100 cities, similar sit-ins had erupted. Well, Ella Baker and others said, look, we now have students in more than 100 cities across the South who are waging these sit-ins against segregation of lunch counters. We really should create a moment where they can get together so they can learn from each other, instead of going along with this in this totally uncoordinated way. So she got Dr. King to give her, I remember, I think it was $500, a pittance, to hold a conference in her alma mater, Shaw University in Raleigh, North Carolina. King gave her the money, because King thought, oh, this will be perfect. They'll become the student wing of SCLC. People from the NAACP came and said, this will be great. We'll get them into the NAACP youth structure. But Ella Baker went around the night before the meetings commenced and suggested to the students that they might want to remain independent, that they might have something to contribute as young people. This is why I must tell you, teaching the history of the Mississippi movement in your classrooms is a particular challenge and a particular privilege, because the people you're talking to, that's the people who made the movement here. Forebears, but not much older than them. She famously said that it may be that we are here for something more significant than a hamburger. That this may be a movement not just that you consider the lunch counter, but to fundamentally change the structure of power in our society. Out of this came the organization SNCC. Well, I don't think anyone from Mississippi was at that meeting, because the city had not yet started in Mississippi. So some months later, when they were making plans for a second conference, after the students had decided to remain independent and then created an organization of their own called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And again, it's a modest title, isn't it? Just a coordinator. In plans for the second, she sent this young man, Bob Moses, who she had met working as a volunteer at SCLC. Bob Moses is a fascinating figure. He's still alive, spent a lot of time in Macomb, Mississippi. A person of extraordinary moral stature, although he would also hate us making a fuss of him. Bob Moses was a math teacher in New York. He'd also had a graduate degree in philosophy from Harvard. He'd gone south to sort of see what was going on, was working in the SCLC office where Baker had some of the same qualms about it that she did. And she said to him, we need some students from Mississippi